We do not want people to get free of porn for the sake of getting free of porn. We want them to get free of porn so they can be better husbands, better fathers.
It's estimated that around 30% of all data transferred across the internet is porn related. Some estimates suggest that between 5 and 10% of internet users may be considered addicted to pornography.
Let's not forget that in 2020, when everybody got sent home, those numbers actually skyrocketed.
Today's guest is Sathiya Sam, a men's coach and speaker who's developed a Bible-backed system to help men overcome porn addiction and live with more integrity and confidence.
I would rather be 100% my true self and rejected than 80% my true self and accepted.
How does someone start the DeepClean process?
If you had a weed in your garden, you can run over it with a lawnmower, but we know as long as the root system is there, it will grow back. Your second option is to actually put the gloves on, get on your knees, do a bit of dirty work, and get the roots out of there.
Hey there, my friends. This is Dr. Anthony Balduzzi, and I want to welcome you back to another episode here on the Fit Father Project podcast. Today, I'm joined by my new friend, Sathiya Sam, who is a world-renowned coach, international speaker, author, and he specializes in helping professional men break free of porn addiction. And this is a big topic, and it's something that we've had on the podcast one before, and I wanted to bring Sathiya on today because the fact is, as we're going to see some of the statistics, whether it's affecting you, it's affecting someone in your circle, maybe even your kids. And Sathiya has developed a signature program called DeepClean that's helped everyone from athletes, doctors, pastors, executives, entrepreneurs, and everyday people break free of porn addiction and regain freedom in their lives from compulsive behaviors and, of course, directly related to porn. But what's unique about his approach is it's both science-backed and biblically based. He's based out of Toronto, Canada. He's happily married, and he's a diehard basketball fan. So I got to ask, is Toronto Raptors, is that your team? Are we just like Canada basketball?
Yeah, 100%. I love the sport of basketball. I'll watch pretty much any team play, but the Raptors are my team for sure.
Got it. I used to be a fan when I actually, as we mentioned, like when we talked and we got to meet, I lived in Toronto for a little bit. Yeah. I was there Vince Carter years. So
oh, dude.
That was like elbow on the rim, the glory years for sure. So
yeah.
Anyways, man, thank you for coming on and discussing this topic. Before I give you the floor, and we're going to have, I'm hoping around a roughly deep hour-long conversation about porn addiction and addiction in general. And for everyone listening, whether or not you feel right now this is a directly related issue to you, we're going to talk about the nature of the addicted and compulsive brain. This is the same addiction patterns that underlie something like food addiction and other things. So there's going to be massive crossover here. And to kind of get a little context in place, in prep for this interview, I went on to ChatGPT and I typed in, ChatGPT, tell me the stats about porn addiction. And these stats are from 2021, but this is what it kicked out. It said it's estimated that around 30% of all data transferred across the internet is porn related. That was in 2019. Sheesh. And according to the data from the website Pornhub, which is a major porn website, it received an average of 115 million daily visits in 2019, making it one of the most visited adult websites. The industry is over $100 billion. However, some estimates suggest that between 5 and 10% of internet users may be considered addicted to pornography. So we're talking an issue in the tune of tens of millions, of hundreds of millions of people, and it's obviously not comfortable to talk about. So you're here with a powerful message, especially being a man that has overcome this and is now leading people through this. So please share us your personal story and tell us why you're a big champion for this message now.
Yeah, for sure. So one thing I'll just add to those stats, you said those are all 2019. So let's not forget that in 2020, when everybody got sent home and was stuck in their offices, those numbers actually skyrocketed and they didn't stay there, but the baseline was elevated. So I think it's just worth noting. Let me backtrack a little bit. I grew up in a pastor's home, so faith was always a big part of my upbringing. My parents sent us to Christian education, and we were low middle class, somewhere in that range. So the reason I mention that is I think porn addiction and addiction in general, we tend to either associate with like the very successful, the ultra successful, the people in Hollywood. We know they all have addictions and whatever, or the people that are deprived and low socioeconomic status. But the reality is porn addiction in particular, I would say, is very prevalent. It is no respecter of class or anything else. And my story is very much a representation of that. I got exposed to pornography in the computer lab of my Christian school when I was 11 years old, if you can believe that. It was 2001. So this is before smartphones and broadband internet, but it was still around. And as the stats you just shared revealed, a lot of the data that transpires on the internet is actually pornographic in nature. So that was my first exposure. I wasn't addicted overnight. It just planted a little seed. A little fact about me actually is I skipped grade 2. So the reason I mention that is because all of my friends were sexually developing at the time, and that's how I got exposed to it. They were kind of into it. I had no sexual development at that point, nothing major at least. I was prepubescent. And so I was actually totally shocked and disturbed and a little bit confused by what I saw, but it planted a seed. And so when I did start to develop sexually, I remembered it. I went back to it, and that sort of began a 15-year journey, if you want to put it that way, where I just gradually struggled more and more, gradually became more dependent on it. By the time I was in university studying, the internet obviously had really gone leaps and bounds, and technology had developed enough that it was so accessible that porn was just an everyday part of my life. I was working super hard at university. So porn was my reward for hard days of work. It was my relief, to take the edge off a little bit. And I would literally start to plan my days around it. I would maybe abandon social commitments, or I would delay them a little bit. And I would always tell myself that's not why I was doing it. But, deep down, I knew that's what was driving a lot of my behavior and a lot of my decisions. So that was sort of the worst of it. In that season is also where I would say I made a commitment from a faith perspective, and I became a Christian. People might be surprised to hear that, but growing up in a pastor's home doesn't really mean that much necessarily from a personal standpoint. At some point, if you're going to do it, you have to make that decision yourself. And so that decision did come, and that's a story we can say for another day. But when I made that decision, because of my upbringing, I knew that there's some moral conduct that came with this lifestyle change. I had to drink responsibly if I was going to drink at all. I knew I had to clean up my language. Like there were things like this, and part of that list was quitting pornography. And I always told myself, I could get rid of this stuff whenever I need to. I just click around here and there. It's not a big deal. I'll stop when I have to. And that time finally came. I had a conviction and an impetus to do something about it. And no matter what I tried, Anthony, I fell back into it again and again. It was like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, or a couple weeks of freedom and feeling like, okay, I got this thing under control, only to, reach a really stressful situation or some sort of relationship conflict or just some situation where I couldn't regulate, I couldn't manage what was going on, and boom, porn was there again and again. So that kickstarted another 5-year journey of trying to figure out why is this so debilitating? Why is it so hard for me to get free? And ultimately figure out what actually does help people move the needle forward. Because at that time, a lot of the information out there just said, put a blocker on your device or try talking to somebody about it. And those are all great things, not against that at all. But you and I both know when it comes to somebody's well-being, there's always going to be symptomatic issues, and we can always blunt the symptoms, or we can figure out what's more causal. And the deeper we can get into that, the more effective our solution is going to be. It's a little bit more work on the front end. It's much more sustainable long term. And so it took me 3 years. I was a little bit thick-skulled about it, but it took me about 3 years to finally get a bit more to the underlying causes. And once I start to experience that freedom, not just sobriety, but actual freedom. It was almost, it was like I need to tell the whole world about this. So I kept it under wraps. I did my own inner work and reached that place of freedom. February 2016 was when I had my last relapse. And December 2018 is when I launched DeepClean, just on a mission to see if I could help other guys do the same. I've been pleasantly surprised to see our methodology working and now spread around the globe. And now it's like, full speed ahead, man. We're just trying to help as many guys get free as possible so they can get their lives back on track.
Absolutely love it. And it's I think I can already feel the deep resonance in relationship to someone who succeeds long-term with a health and fitness journey. They are also addressing causal issues or causal roots of their behavior and then changing things, identities, relationships. And it's inherently deep work. Stuff that compels us and traps us is deep work. It's in the subconscious. It's in our environment. It's in just like neural grooves. And so I really basically want to ask you, let's get into the process of DeepClean in as much detail as you think is relevant in here, but walk us through, because I think guys are going to be able to listen here parallels to the process of basically transforming the mind and the body holistically. So how does someone start the DeepClean process? Walk us through, please.
Yeah, for sure. So let me give the overall philosophy here. The basic premise is if you had a weed in your garden, there was 2 ways you can get rid of that weed. You can run over it with a lawnmower and the garden will look clean. It'll be relatively fresh, but we know as long as the root system is there, it will grow back. It's just a matter of time. Your second option is to actually put the gloves on, get on your knees, do a bit of dirty work, and get the roots out of there. And so our deep clean approach is all about how do we get to the roots. You can install your filters, no problem. You can try praying more. You can talk to accountability partners. All that stuff is great. Not against any of it, but we would consider those to be lawnmower solutions. They're the things that will give you some temporary relief, but we want to get to the underlying facets of this. And typically this boils down to 3 categories. So the first is self-awareness, and each of these categories has a mantra. So our mantra for self-awareness is, if you are not aware, it cannot be repaired. And with men in particular, we did not grow up being taught how to pay attention to our inner thoughts, certainly our emotions, even some of the paradigms that we have. We often get taught the more tactile parts of being a guy, some of the social elements for sure, but it's rarely instilled in us like, hey, you can control your thinking. You can pay attention to how you want to respond in this moment. Anger is not your only option to express your emotion. These are things that guys don't get taught. And because they don't get taught that, they don't realize how much this plays into their sexual behavior, but even at a broader level, just their behavior and decision making in general. So everything starts and begins with awareness. You have to cultivate that first. Our second bucket where the root issues lie is transformation of the heart. This is where we work through things like trauma, childhood and upbringing, parts of the past, resentment, unforgiveness, all kinds of those dynamics that contribute to somebody's development, their worldview, and ultimately, probably most importantly, the way they see themselves. And our mantra for this pillar is, he who is most vulnerable heals the quickest. So this requires a lot of bravery to do work here. Like I said, I had a pretty good upbringing. I always told myself I didn't have trauma, but I actually lost 3 friends to suicide in high school. And I remember the first time I had lost a friend, I remember telling myself, I am not going to cry about this. That was like this benchmark that I had set as like, this is like the way a guy is supposed to respond. I was 14 years old, but it created this pattern of like basically suppressing trauma. Anytime something was difficult, I was masterful at just numbing the heck out of that thing and pushing forward with the mission at hand. But it caught up to me, right? Because obviously nobody can cope with the cares of life doing it that way. And for me, porn was my only way I could actually feel alive and get some sense of connection and everything else. So a lot of it was a trauma response that I had to go back and address. And our third bucket is identity. And the whole concept here, our mantra for identity is, I would rather be 100% my true self and rejected than 80% my true self and accepted. And what we're trying to instill in our guys is a radical sense of, I am who I am, period. No apologies, no backing down. It's not an excuse to be a jerk. It's no reason to be brash or anything like that. But it's just people understanding who they are, what they were made for, why they're on this planet, and then running after it without any inhibitions. So those are the 3 buckets that these root systems typically fall into. And then we sort of envelop this with community. A lot of the research shows that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. So the stronger your connections are, the more plugged in you are, the sense of, we're doing this together and I'm not alone. It's incredibly powerful, not just for getting the momentum going, which, as you and I know, is very difficult anytime you're trying to change behavior, but it's critical for sustaining the behavior long term. And so community is a huge part of what we do, but it's not just that we have built a community. We're very proud of that, but we also teach our clients to plug into their local communities as well, so that they don't become solely dependent on us, because what kind of coaches would we be if they were just dependent on us the rest of our lives anyway? So that's sort of the deep clean philosophy in a nutshell.
That was really well explained. I love that everything has a mantra to it. It just seems like it really encapsulates and gets someone to be able to bring the spirit of each of those pillars to mind and heart very quickly in any given moment. And then the last thing you shared is, it's so funny, like there's other addictions that people do publicly with one another. Like there's people who are addicted to cocaine who go to the nightclubs and like do cocaine with their friends. But like porn is something that is so like in the closet, in the dark, by yourself. Like it's kind of like that kind of thing. And what we're doing here is both doing the inner reflection, but we're also in community shining light on this area that was kept in this like dark guilt, shame, seclusion bucket. And now we're just adding it, bringing it to the surface and keeping it on the surface until like that wound is healed through the constant work. It's like there's nowhere to hide. You're bringing light to the area. And that seems to be uniquely important with porn addiction.
Oh, 100%. I think, I don't know if you're familiar with Brené Brown and some of her work, a lot of shame, talks about shame and all that. And it's amazing how many guys, when they decide to do our program and they log into the online community and they see all the stories and they see the guys, asking questions and stuff. One of the pieces of feedback we get is I had no idea there were other guys struggling. Like, I honestly thought I was the only one, and then when you get into specifics, like things that guys are struggling with, I don't know, certain fantasies or certain fetishes or all that kind of stuff, and they feel so ashamed, like there must be something wrong with me. It's incredibly liberating just to know that there's other people who go through those same experiences. And like you said, I would say porn, and even if we broadened it a little bit, just sexuality in general, like we are a very sexualized culture, but there's still like a very strong sense of stigma attached to a lot of sexuality. And in particular, when we talk about porn, we say that porn is the 3 A's. It's affordable, accessible, and anonymous. And that's what makes it so rampant, but also so quiet and behind closed doors. And I think anyone who's brave enough to talk about this, I give them kudos. And, I was kind of like throwing stones a little bit on the accountability partner systems and stuff. I can explain why if we want to get into it. But to be honest, anybody who's even brave enough to set up an accountability partner system, I give huge props to, because it really does take a lot of courage to open up and talk about your struggles in this area.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, so I want to get into the physiology of porn itself, because it's so interesting that instead of like an external drug or food which you take, which elicits a neurochemical response or alters this, porn comes into this really powerful, deeply rooted orgasm that often happens at the end of a porn session, right? And this is like a powerful state of the brain and the nervous system, leading to this climax of this ejaculation of like the powerful seminal fluid that contains like the DNA. Like, this is some primal shit. This is like the seed of life that we're kind of like taking the nervous system and getting into that. And then often I think what happens is we feel kind of taxed afterwards. And I think when people are addicted constantly in this cycle, it's like you're always obviously looking for the next hit to kind of normalize your nervous system. And you're always having like some degree of dopamine depletion, ramped up, crashed, ramped up, crashed. And then you're on this kind of roller coaster. I want to ask you, in your approach, how important is like the physical practice of like changing your sleep, your nutrition, your exercise? Is that like a big part? Because the pillars you just described, obviously self-awareness and stuff like that is involved in looking out, am I just living like crap, and is that going to do that? I want to ask, how much does the physical healing or regulation with the health habits play into someone's recovery and or sustainability?
It's massive. It's absolutely huge. And it's funny, there's an interplay. So if somebody starts to take better care of their body, they will generally start to experience a better degree of freedom in this area with porn addiction and that kind of stuff. And vice versa. It's been one of the coolest things that I've seen in my clients is once they start to get free, they start asking me about my fitness routine and how I'm taking care of myself and, all that kind of stuff. So absolutely there's an interplay. And I think it's for two primary reasons. I think on the more obvious side, obviously, if you're taking better care of your body, if you have your routines dialed in, when you spoke on my podcast, you gave a really beautiful explanation about circadian rhythms. And a lot of guys have nighttime relapses or they have nocturnal emissions, things that just kind of mess them up in the night and it kind of gets them a little bit triggered and aroused and it's hard to control. If we can really start to take care of the bookends of the day, that works wonders for just mitigating that behavior. So I think there's some obvious correlations there. But the other part of it is confidence. So it feels good to take care of yourself. It feels good to resist the junk food or to go lift some weights or to run a little bit further than you normally run. And that confidence becomes contagious into other areas of your life. Not just being able to overcome porn addiction, but relationships and professionally and otherwise. And so, yeah, we witnessed the whole gamut. It's definitely not as simple as let's just get you clean of porn. That's what a lot of guys realize when they get into this journey, especially when you're tackling causal root issues is, yeah, you're basically improving every area of your life. And so if you already have momentum in fitness, like let's ride that wave. Let's try to figure out what were you doing in fitness that made you so effective here? And how can we transfer some of those things into the recovery process? So yeah, massive interplay.
Nice. And I'm also thinking about this, what you just said, this idea of like vulnerable time. So I think a vulnerable time for people to eat like crap is maybe in the afternoon, between like lunch and dinner. If they're stressed at work, people mindlessly eat. But probably the big one is either after dinner or late at night watching TV or something like that. A lot of people snack. You'd say that's a vulnerable time, a time when people have a high degree of like relapsing or turning to an unhealthy habit. And we help people mitigate that with proper nutrition, slotting in healthy snacks, revisiting their why and their accountabilities and this stuff. So it seems like with porn, there's probably nighttime might be a more vulnerable time, but I guess everyone probably has their own time of when they express their addicted behaviors. How do people do you talk about managing those like key times? I know you mentioned the bookend concept, but like, how do you help people zone in on the times when they have this habit loop that gets continuously initiated, like in their exact daily schedule?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be different for everybody. It is amazing how interconnected it is with dopamine, and that plays a huge role in it, which I hope we can get into a little bit. But before we get there, I would say nighttime is definitely the most prevalent. Even if you study the statistics from a website like Pornhub, which they reveal statistics every single year, year after year, the most common viewing times are always from 10 p.m. to midnight. So that should tell us everything that we need to know. And you can kind of imagine how this goes. You know, you have a long day, you worked hard, you come home, and you know, you're greeted by your family who has demands from you, right? Food that needs to be cooked, or a meal that needs to be cleaned up, kids that need to get put to bed. You're exhausted by the time the day's over. You just want to kick your feet up, and nobody's thinking, oh man, maybe most people aren't thinking, man, I'm just going to go watch some porn to take the edge off. Typically what happens is you flick on the TV, you start scrolling on social media, and that dopamine drip starts to just, slowly drip in the background. And it's a build up. It's something builds up to it. And then before you know it, it's 11 o'clock at night, and now you're looking at, models on Instagram. Now you're clicking around on porn sites, and now you've had, a proper slip or relapse. That's typically the process. And I would say nighttime is the most common. Morning is also another common one as well. Because like some of those hormones are just like sky high in the morning. And also I think there's a bit of a stress, component to it as well. That anticipation of how stressful the day is going to be. And guys are trying to take the edge off as early as possible. So I think the bookends in particular are very prominent.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely love that response. I want to talk, you just mentioned something that I was going to ask you a little bit later, but might as well ask you now. Mm-hmm. It's a leading question, is I'm going to suggest that, especially with what's happened on social media sites, like let's say Instagram in particular. I don't know how many of our listeners are actually actively using Instagram, but your kids certainly are to some extent if you have older kids. Yeah. Has kind of become this weird hybrid of like softcore porn. And now I personally haven't had an Instagram account for like 3, 4, 5 years. Like I don't use that platform, but I just know what's on there. And it's kind of like a weird thing that fitness kind of contributes to it. Like everyone's like fit and like showing their progress pictures, but then that kind of turned into like just glorify, like become a very sexualized and normalized presentation. And yes, like that's easily a trigger for somebody, right? I mean, you can see shit on Instagram that probably would make Playboys from the 1950s look like just like, nothing, or I guess whatever. So
yep.
Speak into that. I guess the interplay of like the social media aspect and how that plays into the current that's pulling people.
Yeah, for sure. So there's two layers to this. I know I'm speaking to fathers, so I'll speak to the fathers directly, and then it's probably we're talking about their children as well. So with fathers, or the adult brain, there's basically the 4 Ds of dopamine that play into your typical relapse. You have the drip, the drown, the deluge, and then the dip. And so the drip is what most people experience on social media. And if you study the neurobiology around addiction, what it shows is whether we're talking about alcohol, drugs, gambling, like whether it's a substance or it's a behavior, the basis of the neurobiological component of addiction is this fascination or this obsession with what's next. What's next? That's all it is. So if I study my own behavior patterns, when I used to, I'd look something up on a porn site and then I would open like 13 tabs, right? And you watch one and then you go to the next one. It's the same concept on YouTube. Once a video finishes, you have within the video other videos you can click on or recommended. Like there's a reason that you have over 600,000 subscribers on your channel, man. Like the algorithm is helping you get these people to keep going, right? To what's next, what's next, what's next. So when somebody's on social media, if you get to the bottom of your feed, that almost never happens because it keeps repopulating it, keeps replenishing it so that what's next, what's next, what's next. When that drip of dopamine starts to happen in your brain, you enter this phase called edging. Edging is where you are constantly just pushing the bounds a little bit to get that kick. And it starts very gradually. This is where we have the justifications of, oh, it's just a little bit of skin. Oh, it's just a little bit of that, whatever it might be. Maybe in the back of your head, I probably shouldn't be doing this, but the pull of dopamine starts to get really strong. And after, if you continue on this long enough, what you see on social media probably is either, number one, it's not going to satisfy, or number two, you're going to start looking for more intense stuff on social media. So what we recommend is, and by the way, by the time you start in that drip process and you start edging, it's almost too late. Like if you can catch yourself edging and you can, close the laptop or whatever, change your environment, that's amazing. But what the research would suggest is if you really want to master this dopamine cycle, the best thing you can do is within the first 3 seconds that you detect it, you need to have what we call a trigger plan. And that trigger plan is what's going to allow you to derail things. Otherwise, it becomes very, very challenging. So when people are scrolling on social media, you have to be very conscious of how am I actually engaging with it? I'm not all against social media, although for most people that do our program, we recommend that they don't participate in it so they can give their brain a chance to reset a little bit because their thresholds are all kinds of messed up. But I would say the major thing is just knowing what can you actually handle, how much of it, because most of us are actually going way too far. And whether your addiction is to pornography or something, social media is probably the thing that gets the ball rolling most days of the week. So that's the adult side of it. The child part of it is very interesting. So children are obviously getting on social media at younger ages. They're getting on things like YouTube at a much younger age. And Anthony, you and I are both entrepreneurs, right? So we know that the most successful companies, the one thing that they do really well is they keep their clients long term. And the best way that a client stays with you long term is, number one, if you provide something that they need long term. Or number two is if they start working with you at a young age and they become so accustomed to having you that it would feel weird to not have you around. So what a lot of these porn sites are doing is they're actually targeting kids because they know that if they can get kids starting to wander and starting to explore these kind of pornographic websites at a younger age, if they get hooked now, it's going to be much more likely that they'll stay with them long term. And obviously that attention is so valuable for them for their ads and everything else. So from a business standpoint, the porn industry actually targets kids, I would say rather maliciously, because they know that if they can get them now, they're going to stay with them forever. And they're going to put way more money in their pockets as a result. So with parents, it's just something to be aware of. It's no longer a question of if your kids get exposed to pornography, it's a question of when. And so the more checks and balances you have, the more conversations you're having around sex. We can get into some of that a little bit if you want. There's things you can do. It's not all doom and gloom, but it is the times and the days that we live in, and parents need to be aware of that.
I am making a mental note for us to loop back on kids and prescriptive stuff for parents and the parenting, but that's going to be at the end of this. Yep. I want to go back to what you said about the trigger plan, because I think it seems very relevant to a similar, I'm going to keep running this parallel, this similar scenario of someone feels that trigger for that cookies with a bag of chips or doing whatever at the end of the night. What is a proper porn trigger plan, or what may one look like?
Yeah, so this is the fun part of recovery, if I can put it that way. We've shared principles that work universally, but the reality is, and fitness is really the same, there's a very individual component to this. And so the trigger plan varies from person to person. I'll give some examples to just kind of get the juices going a little bit here. But the biggest thing when you approach this is, number one, it has to be quick. So it cannot be something that requires a lot of energy or has a high barrier to entry, because the more energy it requires, the less likely it is to really take place when you feel that urge or that impulse. And then the second thing is you have to make sure it's working from you. And there's a bit of an iterative aspect to this where something might work for a little while, and then you find that actually you're getting a bit desensitized to it and maybe you need to try something different. So we have to be kind of experimental about it a little bit. The best thing that I've witnessed personally, and I say this from my own experience, when I was going in recovery, is changing the environment. So if you have a trigger plan in place that is when I feel an urge, I am going to change my room. Like whatever room I'm in, I'm going to go into a different one. This is going to do two things. Number one, it's going to give your brain a little bit of a jolt. So just getting out of that room, very, very helpful. But number two, and you and I both know this, you start moving, and movement is incredibly powerful for getting the blood back to that prefrontal part of your brain, for you to think more coherently, and just for you to be able to get out some of that energy that's probably causing that impulse in the first place. So I think anything that has movement, bonus points for doing that, that's really powerful. Some other ones, people have like a particular scripture or something. Like, again, we have a more faith-based clientele, so having scripture is really valuable. But it doesn't have to be scripture. It could be a song. It could be a quote. It could be just something you heard recently that's speaking to you, something that you bring to mind really quickly. That is really powerful. Another one is maybe it's not walking necessarily, but people have particular movements, stretches that they'll do. Really, really good stuff. Some recovery apps have an SOS button. So SOS means like you press it and it'll send a text to a couple different people that are just there on like a speed dial, if you will. So they get notified right away. That's a pretty cool one as well. So those are some different things that people can do. Some people go and play music, rather than listening to it. I got a guitar up on the wall here. So again, if it's typical that you have something nearby that you can play, that's awesome. So there's no right or wrong here, but again, you just have to try things. Trust your intuition. Like, don't go off what Sathiya says or what worked for Dr. Anthony. Think about, like, what are the things that generally help me regulate, things that generally help me clear my mind. Those are going to be the things that are likely going to be the most impactful in this scenario as well.
Great answer. Really great answer. And also good examples. I was kind of reflecting on what I would do were I in this situation. I think the first thing I would do if I actually had the conscious awareness to notice, okay, this is going in a direction, I'd probably close my eyes immediately, take a couple deep breaths to kind of do a phase shift of the nervous system. Then I was thinking I'd probably stand up, bounce around, and go to a different room. So It seems like these just shifting into transitional states would be really, really good idea.
Yeah, and you just mentioned one that I definitely should have listed in the examples, breathing. It's crazy how much we get into the more sympathetic kind of breathing, short breaths, when we have those impulses. So even just taking a deep breath through the nose, or I know Dr. Huberman's a big fan of take a deep breath through your nose and then take another inhale, really max it out. And that just within about 10 seconds, you're going to feel everything reset for the most part. Again, It's not foolproof, but it is a really good way to hack your physiology a bit when those urges arise.
Love it. Now, you mentioned your community is specifically faith-based, and I make no mistake, I think the most successful organization in helping people break addiction is Alcoholics Anonymous. And one of their rules is basically surrendering to a higher power and understanding that, just admitting vulnerably that this thing is greater than me. So there's not exactly an explicitly Christian component there, but there's a God, higher power, source thing, whatever word you want to use with that. So can you tell me how those kind of either I'd be open to hear direct biblical principles, how that shows up in your specific community, but also how you believe the aspect of God and higher power comes into one's recovery process. And does that differentiate someone who succeeds or fails if they have a strong tie to that element, or is it not related?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A little bit of a complicated one. The first thing I'll say is that what we do is not exclusively faith-based. I would just say that, probably 80% of our client base are faith-based. But what we've observed, we've actually had some phenomenal success with people who are of other faiths or not really faith-based at all. They're kind of more agnostic, but they get the biblical component, or they understand at least the principles that are undergirding what we do. So, regardless of where you stand on this spectrum, for those of you that are listening, freedom is available to all, and you don't have to be super plugged in on a faith level. That being said, I will say that faith offers two particular things for people that is really captivating and compelling during recovery. The first is a sense of purpose. And when we get into some of the deeper inner workings of our clients, what we often find is one of two things. Either they have lost their sense of purpose. They don't know why they're here. Life kind of has lost this sense of any kind of excitement. It feels meaningless. It feels gray. Or they have a sense of purpose, but they just feel like because of their addiction, because they can't get this thing under control, they're never going to achieve it. They're never going to be good enough. They'll always be a hypocrite. They'll always have this thing against them. So that sense of purpose that comes from spiritual life is incredibly valuable because it gives you something that you're aiming towards. We do not want people to get free of porn for the sake of getting free of porn. We want them to get free of porn so they can be better husbands, better fathers, so they can go start that business they always wanted to start, so they can get more plugged in at their church, but or whatever it might be. There's nothing right or wrong here, but we know that people were made for something bigger than this. And for us, porn is just the obstacle. It's just the thing we need to get out of the way so that you can continue to run forward with everything that you want to do with your life. So that sense of purpose is incredibly powerful. And for me, I believe that God has designed all of us with purpose. I don't believe that we're here by accident. And for me, I've never felt more alive doing the work I'm doing. I think that God has given me the ability to communicate, the ability to coach, the ability to lead. And so these are things that were very motivating for me when I was struggling. I was always conscious of, if I can figure this out for me, think of how many other people I can help. I always had that sense of purpose anchored to my recovery. And that was very valuable on those hard days when the impulses were high, or I just had a relapse and I thought, why not just binge again? What's the difference? That sense of purpose is what gets me back on track. The second layer to the conversation around spirituality are the values that you live by. And I think that this is where the sexualization of our society, and I would say even the pornification of our society, in my opinion, has made me really sad, because what we see is that people are objectifying other people as normalcy. The typical porn video now shows acts of violence. That's been shown. I think about 80% of mainstream porn has acts of violence or aggression towards women in particular. And you can start to imagine how, if you if you think that promiscuity is normal, having multiple partners, violence and aggression, a lot of the porn industry is actually fueled by sex trafficking. So if these start to become normal in your life, your concept of what a person is, how they should be treated, how you should be treating other people, all of these things now start to become distorted. And so the one thing that we see on the spiritual side is, I think when people plug into that, if you look at any of the religions or anybody who has a value for spirituality, it is anchored by a set of values and virtues on how you view the world, how you view yourself, how you view God, and how you view others. And I think that starts to get resuscitated when people start to quit pornography. It's almost like it would be impossible not to, because once you start to get that stuff out of your life, you cannot help but see people through a different lens.
Yeah, that was a beautiful answer. Really, really eloquent and well said. And it also makes me think too, kind of to take this conversation back to the kids now, that we know that kids are being targeted by the porn industry, and we know that they're not getting direct sex education from their parents. That's a domain that parents don't actually model behavior for their kids. So they're now getting impressed by this particular presentation, and for a young boy that would normalize certain behaviors and attitudes and adjustments, and for a young girl it might normalize receiving sex in this kind of way, and that this is just how it is. And so it's fascinating and also sad and scary that could really imprint a whole framework on the next generation of humans that will grow up to be adults, that then may model those behaviors to their kids. So it's fascinating how the consciousness around sex gets just transmitted generationally through this quiet industry, because parents aren't directly touching and teaching their kids about this. Damn, right?
Yeah, well, that's exactly it, man. I mean, if I look at my own story, I grew up, my parents are immigrants from India. So in Indian culture, you don't talk about sex. My dad was a pastor, in a conservative church. You don't talk about sex. We had every reason to not talk about it. And it really left a lot of questions, a lot of unanswered questions, a lot of confusion. And porn was the only thing that seemed to provide some sort of clarity in those areas. So the one piece of advice that we always give to parents is start talking about sex at a young age. Obviously, it has to be age appropriate, but the more comfortable that your kids get having these conversations, the more likely they are to come to you when they do get exposed to pornography, or when they do hear something weird at school that they're not so sure about. If you've never had that conversation, your kid is not going to come to you. They're going to go to somebody else that feels way safer and seems to be more comfortable talking about it. So that's the one thing we encourage, especially, fathers whose kids are relatively young. But there's no time like the present. You can start at whatever age your kids are at. You can start having those conversations. And the biggest thing is just that you don't freak out. It's the hardest thing for fathers to do, right? Because you hear maybe about what your kids have seen, what they've done, what they've been exposed to. And if they get a negative experience when they're sharing something that's really vulnerable for them and something that took a lot of courage, they're not going to return back to you. And you want to play the long game with this. The goal is not just that you teach your kid, hey, don't watch pornography. What you want to do is you want to teach your kid, hey, you have there's a sexual part of you, and there are things you can do that will either help it or hurt it. And that choice is up to you. And let me show you, here are some things you can do that will actually help it. And if you avoid these things, then actually you won't encounter some of the pain that maybe I experienced or that your mother experienced or whatever it might be. And that's the second thing that parents can do as well, is share your stories. I think parents are often afraid, if let's say, again, like we don't think anything as college buddies when, we're watching porn or we're doing all this promiscuous stuff. And then you have a daughter and all of a sudden everything changes, right? Cause you know what it's like to be that college age boy, all the dangers that are out there for her. And, the one thing I think we often fear is that if I tell my kids about my shortcomings and where I failed, they will lower their bar. They'll think, oh, well, dad messed up in this area, so what's the big deal? Very rarely the case. What's more likely to happen is they say, oh, dad made this mistake. Here's what he would have done differently. I'm going to try it. Or this is where dad was able to this is what he was able to accomplish. I'm going to see if I can do something differently or improve it. That's in the heart of every child. They want to eventually exceed their parents. And so you lose nothing by sharing their story. And then the byproduct, of course, is that they then feel like they can trust you because they're like, okay, dad's not perfect. He didn't have it all figured out. Which means I don't have to have it all figured out either. It's okay that I'm kind of fumbling my way through this because, sexuality is incredibly complicated. So lots of hope for parents, but it is a little bit counterintuitive what's required to do this well.
Yeah, it requires the vulnerability and the self-work. Like someone has to have gone through this themselves and be able to be confident enough to share it. And I love how you even frame that like we have a sexual part of our beings. There is a healthy and an unhealthy expression of it, or there's things you can do action-wise that strengthens you and things that weaken you. And I think that same conversation is what could be taught to kids on the nutrition front, right? Yeah. We have nutritional needs to our body, and there's certain things you can eat that strengthen you and improve your energy, and other things that make you weaker and slow, more sluggish, etc. So it's like, what a beautiful way, because you're giving your child the power of like choice, and they understand the landscape. And we obviously do all have the impulse for personal thriving. Like we want to ideally, when we're well adjusted, do things that are aligned with what is good for supporting our well-being. So puts the kids in the driver's seat. And I think the sex education talk almost needs to be partly now talking about porn too. We need to almost talk about the landscape. Because I mean, look, what's around the corner is VR, augmented reality. The amount of data that's going to be transmitted on that kind of stuff, like Apple recently just came out with their new AR glasses thing. I don't know if you've heard or seen that, but I've
seen it. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, this is going to be the start of commercially available immersive stuff. We've had some of these VR headsets, but like this is only going to become more intense. It's only going to become more visceral, and there's nowhere to hide, right? So I think parents almost need to I see this image of parents like kind of stepping forward with like this pointed shield as like stuff's flying by in terms of how society's going. And you just need to be able to cut through this with your kids behind you and them see that you have this shield, you have taken damage, you're doing this because it's good for them. And then eventually they'll be strong enough to take a shield beside you. And and that's ultimately how these things change, because these destructive behaviors ultimately, as you know, lead to a dark hole. It's not like they continue forever. There is a rock bottom.
No, 100%. And the one thing we haven't talked about that's probably more relevant now that we're on the parenting side of it is the one thing that a parent always longs for in their kid, besides the things we've already talked about, confidence and a value for their body and taking care of themselves, you want your kids to have healthy relationships. Mm-hmm. And pornography severely blunts our capacity for meaningful connection, deep, meaningful connection, and our sense of even what is a healthy relationship. And so by I love that visual you just gave, like having that shield, leading the way, protecting your family, and instilling some of these measures and checks and balances we're talking about. You're not just protecting your kid from, the evils of the world, so to speak. You're actually setting them up to have good relationships, to learn how to have healthy connections with other people. You're giving them a foundation that they are going to really appreciate when they enter their latter years. So there's lots of different sides to this. Obviously, we talked about the spiritual component as well, your sense of purpose and the values you live by. all of those things get installed or fortified at a deeper level when you are protecting them from the harms of pornography and everything that's associated with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, well said again. I want to turn this in the last part of this back onto the individual listening to this. And I kind of want to call out specifically like married men, because I think there's a lot of like you can think of a younger man, single, addicted to porn, and for whatever reason that feels like more socially acceptable, right? But now you have this idea of a married man who, as you described, stressful day, maybe he hasn't been intimate with his wife in a long time, or they have different libido things have changed, life is stressful, marriage is not great, and porn ends up being his like little reprieve that he has. And not to shame him for that, but I think I'd like to speak into the nature of the married man listening to this that has some kind of porn addiction right now. And whether it's you listening to these words right now, and this is a time to like really feel into the fact that you're receiving this message at a very opportune time where you now have a choice from this conversation to decide how you want to proceed from this point forward in terms of help and self-awareness and all of that. Or that you have a friend in your life, and he probably hasn't told you about this, that is going through this right now. Just based on the stats, it's just probably true. You have a close friend who's doing this in the closet. So like speak into the married man going through this right now. And again, maybe even as just reiterating some of the things we've covered, I want to give this man a message of strength and hope in this moment.
Yeah. I think anybody who's in that moment and in that place, you're probably feeling a lot of fear. And I want to just assure you that there's only two ways that this situation ends. You either confess or you get caught. There's really no other way. And the fear that you're experiencing is you're imagining that, you know, people are going to think differently of you. Your wife's going to leave you. You might lose everything. The chances of those things happening is severely lowered or reduced when you confess. Because the confession of something secret in your life is actually a display of integrity. And it is the beginning of establishing trust or rebuilding trust in a relationship. But when you get caught, when you have hidden something and you get caught doing it, the chances of the mistrust, the sense of betrayal, everything else becomes severely heightened. So you actually have a lot of power. You have a lot of control in this moment to influence the outcome of this situation. And yes, it's going to take a lot of courage. Yes, it could change things. I'm not promising that it's super smooth along the way. But what I can say is, you know, we just finished working with a guy who's 70 years old. And in his words, he basically would cheat on his wife every opportunity he got, his words. And what fueled a lot of his kind of sex addiction and all the affairs was pornography. And when he had come to us, he got caught. His wife was ready to leave him. He said, give me another chance. And she kind of came around. And he basically dedicated 2 years of his life where he was working with us. He worked with a couple other people as well, got his life back on track. The marriage stayed intact. And the one thing that he said that he learned in those 2 years in particular is he said he was honest about everything. He would start to confess temptations because he realized how detrimental it was when he got caught, how much it hurt her and how bad it was for the marriage. And he thought he was going to lose everything. That he discovered that power of confession, just talking about things early and often. And all of that is to say is, if somebody like him can struggle for 5 decades, can have multiple affairs, could almost lose everything and still turn things around, you can too. But I would say if we can learn anything from his situation, it would be don't get caught. Be the bigger man, come clean about it. Have an honest conversation, and that'll give you a fighting chance in your situation. Otherwise, you're basically just delaying the inevitable, which is that you get caught and worse things are going to happen. I'm talking to mostly fathers here. So there's not just implications for your marriage. We're talking about your kids and their kids and beyond as well. So really think about this long term. Now is a chance. And if you're wondering, well, Sathiya, I don't know who to talk to about this. Here's a question that I would ask you. Who is the safest person in your life that you could talk to about something personal and not get judged? Who's that person? They don't have to be certified. They don't have to be a professional. It doesn't matter. Just who's that person that is the safest. That's where you start. Just start there, and that'll get the ball rolling. Usually a path will start to unfold. You can start to get help from a professional. At that point, you can check out what we're doing if you want. There's other options available, but start with that safe person in your life. That's going to be incredibly liberating, and maybe that'll give you a chance to process it a little bit before you have a conversation with your significant other.
Man, you're good at this, dude. I just want to say, like, this has been a really inspiring conversation. Like for me, and it's a privilege to be able to have had you on for, almost a full hour now, kind of getting deep into this stuff. I know this is really going to help somebody. And I also just want to reiterate again, the promise of what happens when you break free of any type of addiction. You could apply this same concept that we just talked about to your addiction to sugar, to your addiction to alcohol, to your addiction to smoking, but in this case, porn. The amount of bringing all those things you've been hiding and the amount of energy you don't even know requires to have that. The dysregulation of your system, the feeling of being free, the feeling of walking your highest path, how much that illuminates every area of your life, the feeling of integrity. Like, there's not a price we can put on that. You can't bottle that stuff up. It must be earned. And I think what everyone else in our Fit Father community certainly knows is that when there's an area of your life where you want to get deep on, certainly when you went through your fitness journey with us, or you're still in the throes of it right now, it's to do the things that we do inside Fit Father. Write that mission statement, get the proper plan in place, surround yourself by brothers, work it, get feedback, tweaks, brush yourself back up if you fall onto the ground and stumble, and keep pressing forward. And so I do, even without having gone through your specific process, like, I want to urge people to get plugged into DeepClean if this is an area you need help with. Like, just don't go stumble around on your own. Sure, you can try some stuff from this conversation, but like, man, there's people who figure this out. Sathiya is the guy who's figured it out. So I think on that note, please tell us where people can learn more about your work, where they can check out your programs, and where they can get connected if they were very inspired by this, or if they want to send it to somebody.
Yeah, for sure. You know what? The easiest thing to do is actually to check out our podcast. We have a daily show called Unleash the Man Within. We have world-class guys on there, including yourself, Dr. Anthony. And so if people are looking for, again, just some more material, a bit of a deeper dive into this stuff, that's a great place to start. If people want to get a little bit more into the recovery process, we have a book called The Last Relapse. And you can buy that book anywhere the books are sold, or you can get a free PDF at thelast-relapse-book.com. We've just tried to be very generous with our information because our programs are full on. We do the full suite of one-on-one coaching and group coaching, and really comprehensive program. So that's available for people as well. But if they want to get a taste of what we do without any major charge to them, the book is for free. It's thelast-relapse-book.com, or the podcast is Unleash the Man Within.
Perfect, brother. Thank you again for this conversation, for shining light on this. I'm excited to see you go far and wide throughout the world and be a champion for this message. And I know a lot of kids are going to benefit. I know a lot of Fit Fathers today benefit. So thank you again.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Anthony.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Fit Father Project podcast. If you love what you heard, please rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts. It really helps spread this show to more men who need this valuable info. To watch full video episodes of this podcast and other motivational videos to inspire your training and more, visit our Fit Father Project YouTube channel. It's free, and everything's made for busy guys over 40 like you. Visit youtube.com/Fit Father Project to get access to our entire video library. And finally, if you or someone in your life is interested in becoming a fit father, or needs help losing weight, building muscle, and living healthier after age 40, then visit fitfatherproject.com, where you can see our proven programs, supplement line for guys 40 plus, and free meal plan and workouts to get you started. This is Dr. Anthony Balduzzi signing off. I'll see you in the next episode.